Hello everybody, welcome to episode 19 of FranFunnel Live, season 1. I guess we're almost ready to go to a season 2. I don't know how many episodes we would have before we need to do that. But a special guest today, lead engineer on FranFunnel, Alex Redmon has joined us. And based on some things that we've been working on recently, I really wanted to get around to talk about what we see the differences between iPhone and Android development. Obviously, as a mobile app, we are in both the Play Store and the App Store, and behind the scenes, that actually causes a whole lot of rancor. So, Alex, welcome. I'll start by simply asking you, for those of us who are not technical, can you just give us a brief overview of what's the difference between something being between developing for Apple or developing for Android? Are there differences at the high level?
So we're actually taking advantage of some technology that makes it easier than ever to develop at the same time for both platforms. We're using React Native for our mobile development. In the past, it was a lot harder to make a native app. There were completely different languages for the platforms. So we're using the same language to write the code that goes into both the iOS and the Android versions of our app.
Gotcha. So in the back end, it is a single code base that we're using for no matter what type of phone that you have.
So we are using the same language,
Okay.
and it is largely the same base. There are one-offs that we make by the platform to platform, but for the most part, we've got the exact same code that's running on both platforms right now.
Can you give me an idea, when you say a one-off, what would be a one-off that would be located in Apple or Android that wouldn't work well shared across them?
So the big thing that you notice immediately are things like screen sizes and just device differences. So Apple, we have a handful of different devices that we need to make our app ready for. Apple will not accept an app that doesn't work on both, all their different primary iPhones that are active right now, and iPad. Android has so many devices, just dozens upon dozens of devices, that trying to target each one specifically is a lot harder. So we have little one-offs to accommodate for things like that.
Gotcha. And for someone who is just starting, imagine they're starting their own company or starting to get into the app game, if you would, do you recommend this kind of unified system where you don't have to have two separate things? You can actually have a single React Native. Have you liked that?
It's the best of both worlds, because not only does this code work on both platforms, and it's simple to get up and something that I would recommend doing, but it is, for the most part, with my experience, easier than it was to develop on either platform individually prior to this technology. So it's easier for me, for instance, to write this app for iOS and Android than it was 5 years ago for me to just write an iOS or just write an Android app.
Gotcha. And so going to when we're actually testing this stuff, so we have apps that are live or preview apps or whatever it may be, what would you say is the better behaved app? Which one behaves more like what you would expect, Apple or Android?
I am a little bit partial to the iOS ecosystem,
Okay.
so I tend to prefer iOS. I like the feel of the native UI components, so things like buttons are going to look more natural to me in iOS, so I tend to veer towards that. But I think there's an added factor that Apple is much more strict with their regulations and what makes it in their app store. Android, I can put an app in there, and without any eyes on it, it will come up live, and I can send it around the world for people to download non-functionally to their phones and not work.
Gotcha.
Apple would not let that fly. Apple, if there's even a simple performance issue, if a screen takes too long to load and they don't like it, you're shut down and you're blocked out of the App Store for that. So because of that stringent process, I think you wind up with a more polished product generally on Apple. That doesn't mean that you can't have a polished product, and we have, for the most part, a pretty equal standard for Android and iOS, but that's kind of where that leans.
So let's, if we just say for the time being that I like your characterization that on Android you can just throw anything out there, and I know that that's not actually true, but for the most part it tends that way. Can you give people an idea of what is the process? So I have an app, I'm ready for it to go into the App Store. What does it look like to actually get that process accomplished?
To get the app into the App Store,
Yeah.
we have to perform a build, which is a little bit more involved than our standard running locally process. It just gets all of the code ready, compiles it to the bytecode for the phone. We send that out to Apple. That takes anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days for them to get to, just to look at. And then once they begin that review process, they could notice something immediately that shuts it back out, or they could review it almost immediately. So I've seen that take anywhere from on the order of hours to days to a week to turn around to either be a rejected or an accepted app.
And have we been rejected before?
We have been rejected.
And what were we rejected for?
We've been rejected for a number of different things in the past. We had a glitch once with our API, so we were utilizing a new API function. We hadn't pushed that out. So locally, our development server had the API, and when we were deving the app locally, it worked. But as soon as we tried to publish it to them, they couldn't see our development API. They were looking for our live API. It didn't work. So we had to, of course, push that out.
So it sounds like in the way you describe this, mentally it's focusing the majority of your energy on making sure that it's working on iOS. It's a more stringent approval process. It sounds like you're playing more within Apple's rules. And then would you say it's fair characterization to kind of almost design and build it for iOS and then edit it into Android the way you want? Is that how you think about it? Or you really are thinking about it as two separate things? Like how mentally when you're going through these things?
At this time, that's predominantly the procedure that we're taking. There aren't enough things that are peculiar to each environment to justify needing to really apply much more focus to the Android side of things. Plus, our current user base is enough on the iOS side that it makes a lot of sense to just do the iOS one first and then take a look and polish the Android version, which usually is pretty quick. It doesn't take a lot to catch that up to iOS, if anything.
For sure. I know there's a lot out there. We're just joining a large corpus of information out there about the newest Android and iOS. I'll ask you final question. What is something that you've learned through your iOS and Android process that might be something that somebody can't read somewhere else, like a little tip or trick that you've learned in the whole thing? You're like, hey, I'd like to pass that on to people. Is maybe when you're thinking about doing this, something that you've learned?
I think it's just always to double check, just always be measuring twice before you cut. So whenever you're in the app game and you're trying to push out a release, for instance, whenever we're dealing with the iOS App Store, if I need to get a build through and I'm looking at a few hours to over a week to being able to have that satisfaction, that's a lot different from developing in a world where you can push a button and get your code out there immediately. So especially if you're playing in the iOS game, it would just be to double check your work before you go out with it because it's not so easy to roll back.
Nice. Well, we certainly are experts around here in the Android and iOS world. For those of you out there who are thinking about these things, we'd love to talk to you. A day doesn't go by that I'll even use the term quirks. That the quirks of this kind of mobile app universe affects us in some way, shape, or form. Sometimes it's on the development side, sometimes it's on the user side, sometimes it's a piece of news that we otherwise affects us in some way, shape, or form. And we don't even, we're not even subject to the algorithms that they're using to promote. I can only imagine that if we needed them to make our app popular, that would be a whole different world. But thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for episode 20.